Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with Pat McGuire. You are an RTV visiting scholar, and we are going to be talking about a pretty hot topic, and that is the extent of Noah's flood. So my question is, when we're looking at the flood, and we're looking at the biblical account of Noah's flood, what would we expect to see, like geological records? What would we see if the flood were global, that is, covering the entire earth with water?
Okay, if you're going to cover the entire earth with water, then you're going to see deep water marine sediments over the entire planet. And you're not going to see lots of other depositional systems, but it will be deep water deposits virtually everywhere.
Okay, so now what would we expect from the other interpretation, which is that the flood was local in that it covered a smaller area of the surface of the earth in water? What would we see in the geological records?
Well, what we actually see in the geological record is we have a broad variety of depositional systems all around the planet. So, for example, if you go to Canyonlands in Utah, you see incised valleys, which are rivers flowing across the Colorado Plateau and etching out these deep canyons. If you go again to Utah and you go to Zion National Park, you see some of my favorite outcrops, which is the Navajo sandstone, which are these 1,000, 2,000 foot tall cliffs. And they are essentially fossilized sand dunes. So think of the biggest sand dunes you've ever seen in the Sahara Desert. These guys were every bit as big. So this is a depositional system, deep desert, that doesn't have any water at all. So what you see around the world is some river deposits, some deep desert deposits, lots of limestone, which is shallow marine environments. So you see a lot of different kinds of depositions all around the planet. So if the flood was limited in extent, that makes sense. If the flood is global in extent, then you really wouldn't expect to see what we actually see in the geologic record.
So the geologic record then shows that if there were a flood, it would be local in extent. And we aren't seeing any scientific evidence for a global flood. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
So kind of a concern then that some Christians would have is, sure, the scientific data may or may not point to a local or global flood, but surely the Bible only allows for one interpretation. So in looking at the Genesis creation account and looking at the flood account, does it allow for an interpretation other than a global flood?
Well, I think it not only allows for it, I think that's actually a better interpretation.
Okay, how so?
Well, one of my favorite observations, and I'm not the first guy that's made this observation, but in Genesis 8, it says that the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Not the mountain, but the mountains. And then after a little bit, I think it's a week or so, then the tops of the mountains around became visible. And then Noah sends out the dove, and she flies around and she comes back because it says she found no place to rest the sole of her feet, for water covered all of the surface of the earth. The exact same wording. But all of the surface of the earth, well, the ark is on a mountain and Noah's looking around and seeing all these mountains. So clearly, when it said all the surface of the earth, that's not the globe. That was from the point of view of the dove. She couldn't get to those other mountains over there. But so that was all the surface of the earth to her. But Noah could see the mountains.
See the tops.
So clearly we have to be smarter than just all the surface of the earth means the entire planet, because I don't think the Bible allows that as a legitimate interpretation.
So we have the scientific data pointing to a local flood and the biblical account really leaning toward a local flood interpretation as well. And something that I think non-Christians might push back against is this idea of a global flood, because they'll say there's not enough water. So it seems like having a local flood interpretation would also help us to engage in conversation with non-Christians about the legitimacy of this account and therefore kind of biblical accuracy. How would you use that to have a conversation with a non-Christian?
Well, I agree with your thought that if you had enough water to cover Mount Everest, then where did all the water go? Because in Genesis 8, it said it recedes, and it receded steadily, and it kept on receding. So it's receding, it's going somewhere. And if you've got water covering the top of Mount Everest, where does it go? So I think it's much easier to have a conversation with maybe a skeptical person if you have a localized flood as opposed to a global flood.
Thank you so much for that. If you want to hear more on this topic, go to reasons.org and search the Genesis flood.